Hi, everybody. As we roll into week 10, we're going to focus on a single poem, which is T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And I chose to do this for a few reasons. First of all, you're polishing off those group presentations I know this week, and you'll be getting ready and diving into your final project. You should be working on that already. I know you've got quite a bit going on right now, but also because The Wasteland is a difficult poem, but it's also one of the most significant poems of the modern era. So I thought by taking some time to actually focus just on that single work, we'd probably get a lot better sense of how some of the elements of modernism that we've explored already are manifest in Eliot's work. And Eliot is in many ways sort of the prototypical modern writer. His works really wrestle with what it means to live in the post-World War One shattered Europe. The kind of the detritus of the civilization that has been in place for so long, which has undergone so many changes in the late 19th and especially the early 20th century. What I want to do is walk you through just what we're doing this week, because this week's discussion post in particular requires a little bit of pacing. There's a particular way I want you to go about it. So let me just scroll down here. This is the week 10 folder, the module, with all of your week 10 resources. I'll look at those more carefully with you in just a second. But let's come down here and look at the discussion board post to begin with. What we need here is an idea of sequencing. So what you're going to be looking at this week, in addition to the wasteland, is reader response criticism, which it's more than just reflecting on how something makes you feel, but really the heart of reader response is, how do I as a reader respond to this text? One of the elements of Eliot's style, and of the style of many modern poets, is that while there is something being said, and there's substance, and there's structure, and the images and the metaphors have meaning, a lot of what the modern authors are doing are also choosing images, choosing language that is intended to have a specific effect on us. So Eliot is describing this sort of shattered cultural wasteland that he sees the Western world as having what shattered into, broken into, moved into in the early 20th century. So while he is bringing in a lot of allusions, which are these references to other works of literature, in a way that is aimed at making a very specific point, he's also using images that are intended to jar us, to make us feel a certain way. And many of the explanations of this poem, really, there's some of the images can't thoroughly be understood just logically saying, okay, well, this is what Eliot meant for this to mean, or this is what it represents. A lot of these images are there to have an effect on how we feel and how we view the world through the lens of the wasteland. So before you read anything else or go through any of the resources, except for maybe the very first link, which is Reader Response Criticism, the Purdue Online Writing Lab's brief article on reader response criticism, before you do anything, I want you to read the poem. And when you read the poem, I want you to have a piece of paper in front of you, and I'm going to ask you to complete what's called a double entry journal. You draw a line down the middle of the piece of paper. On the left side, you jot down passages from the poem that strike you, images that are really powerful, that make you feel strongly or that you don't understand. And then in the right column, beside those passages, just write a little bit about how they made you feel or why you thought to include them in your double entry journal. Okay, and then at the end of each section, the wasteland is divided into a number of sections. At the end of each section, take a few minutes just to free write on how that section made you feel, what you think it means, how it connects to your experience, whatever. It's free writing, so it can be anything really, but just get your thoughts and impressions of that section on paper. Okay, so the first part of your post is going to ask you to draw in that double entry journal to reflect on how the poem made you feel. And I'm going to suggest and that you can leave it at that for at that point. But I am going to suggest that when we move into the second part of that discussion board post, that you then maybe focus on one of the sections that was most interesting or struck you the most. But for your initial part of the post, just go through that double entry journal and share your impressions of the poem. What did it mean to you? Don't worry about understanding it completely. At this point, your goal is just to let it affect you and reflect on how it connected out to other things in your life, other things you feel, think, have experienced. And you can share your understanding of the poem, what it seems to mean to you as well, but that's not really mandatory at this point. The other step then, after you've done that, I'm going to ask you to reread the poem very carefully. And I provided a resource which you may have seen before. It's actually designed more for high school students, but it is a resource designed to provide kind of a walkthrough of works of literature in language which is reasonably contemporary. You know better than I whether they get that right or not. Sometimes when um, profs try to sound contemporary, it just winds up being really unpleasant for everybody involved. This is Schmoop, which you may have seen before. What I want to do is just show you how to negotiate this site. I'm going to ask you to take some time exploring the explication, the explanation, the analysis of the wasteland on here. The second part of your discussion post then will kind of compare, contrast your initial reactions to the poem to what the poem, quote unquote, actually means. In other words, what is it that critics or Eliot himself or people who've studied Eliot have decided the poem means or believe the poem means. Okay, so it'll be a chance to engage in reader response criticism and then to place that in the broader context of what scholars or kind of professionals say about the wasteland. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Here's Schmoop. I just want to show you how to negotiate the site. You will, when you log in, or when you, sorry, click the link that takes you to Schmoop, you're going to see all of this stuff up top. Okay, this is what Schmoop uses to fund itself. So you scroll down here and you're going to see The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Okay, read the introduction. The introduction in your text is also excellent, and do read that carefully, but also read the introduction here. And then the way you negotiate Schmoop is you click on these links on the left. Okay, so you click on summary. You will then have to scroll down here past all the ads to the summary of the poem. Now, here you get kind of a top level, very brief overview of each of the sections. This is the important part, and this is why I wanted to share this as a video. You then need to click on these links again to get a more detailed discussion line by line, and this is really what I want you to read. This poem is just chock full of references to other works of literature, some of which we've read, or some of which really represent the kinds of genres we've explored. What Eliot does in part in this poem is he pulls together these masterpieces of world literature and uses them, shards of them, pieces of them in the poem to kind of draw this contrast between uh, the decline he sees in civilization in the modern era and what we had been capable of in the past. So it's important to read through these. And I'll say, for example, here, these aren't even completely perfect. Eliot begins a poem with April is the cruelest month. You'll see in the video I shared from another project, it's a discussion of the Khalil Gibran's A Prophet, but I bring in Eliot because both are writing at about the same time and taking very different approaches to how to deal with this new reality of 20th century life. But April is the cruelest month. April, of course, is spring, and these lines are in part making the point that um, there is pain sometimes in remembering and feeling the stirrings of life again when you're in this sort of desolate world. In other words, you have maybe memories of youth, for example, or kind of yearnings that you've buried, and as winter has gone by, you've been able to kind of keep them under the surface. In the springtime, these can rise to the surface and actually cause you pain and suffering. one of the echoes that Eliot intends here is to the Canterbury Tales, which begin with Juan Dadapril Shore Sud, and I talk about that a little bit in that other video. That is one of the greatest works of early English literature, and so by invoking the beginning of that here at the beginning of his poem, Eliot will make us think about that sharp contrast. The challenge of this is you really have to be well read to just sit down and make out all of Eliot's references. And that's why this Shmoop resource is going to be really useful to you. So then in the second part of your discussion post, you will compare your initial impressions with what what the people at Shmoop had to say. And you can explore other resources as well. If you want to look for like the Bartleby.com version of the text with annotations is extremely good, and some of those are a little bit higher level. I'd just be careful of some of the e-note sites and things like that. Some of those are pretty good, and you can explore them if you really want to. But I think between Shmoop and Bartleby.com, if you want something that's more targeted towards college students or scholars, those are probably the two that'd be most useful. I have linked to, and here let me just quickly go through the resources, and then I'll let you go. This is the first resource, which is the Reader Response Criticism Definition Description at the Purdue's Online Writing Center. This is a link to what I just showed you, the wasteland analysis on Shmoop. And then these are a number of kind of takes on parts of the poem. Two reasons I've included these. One of these is in your group project that you're going to be presenting next week, week 11. So in about 2 weeks, we're in week 9 right now, so next week is week 10, so week 11. You are in a way either preparing or reflecting on performances or adaptations of works, or sorry, adaptations of works, not performances. This list shows you a number of adaptations. It also includes performances, which I think are really, really interesting. Also, because we're tackling reader response this week, I think it's interesting to see how this one work of literature has inspired different readers differently. Okay, so take some time to view these. They're not long. None of them are long. The one that is longer is probably the longest is this musical adaptation of The Wasteland. It's about an hour. Don't watch the whole thing, but you can, if you want to watch it, of course, you're welcome to watch it. But just kind of look through bits of it to see how this group added music to a performance of The Wasteland. This is a cinematic short of the very beginning of the poem by David Joseph. This is another take on the Burial of the Dead, which is the first part of the poem. This is, if it's what I'm thinking of, it is a reading of the Burial of the Dead over images from that period that kind of reflect what's going on in the poem. Unreal City is a short animated film based on that section of the poem. I would watch this for sure. Fiona Shaw has produced a series of videos. Well, she's been performing this poem forever, but she's produced a series of videos for a new iPad app, or not that new, but an iPad app which features the poem and then all sorts of really neat supplemental material on the wasteland. And this is her performing this part of the poem, and it's really worth watching because it's a section of the poem that really includes a strong sense of character, and then she kind of embodies that character. This is Eliot reading from the fire sermon. We have a lot of recordings of him reading his verse. Interesting to hear it. You'll find that some other performances that we have here are actually much better than Eliot's own performance. It's very interesting to hear the poet reading in his own voice. This is a short video I did for a book club, and the book club was reading The Prophet. It was an online book club by Khalil Gibran, and The Prophet, it was what came out like the year right before or right after The Wasteland. I can't remember. They came out within a year of each other, and I just was interested by the contrast between these two authors' approach to the modern world. The Prophet is sort of this revisiting of religious literature, spiritual literature, while The Wasteland is just diving headfirst into what Eliot sees as the reality of the modern era, that sort of shattered wastelandy thing. And I just stuck this in here because the whole time I was working on this week's module, I had Baba O'Reilly by The Who stuck in my head for obvious reasons. So if you would like to experience that, that is there for you. So that is everything. So remember, this week you start with that double entry journal. You don't look at anything else in these resources, especially not the Schmoop site, right away. Read the poem, record your responses in that double entry journal, and then when you get around to writing your discussion post, you'll draw in that journal for material for the first part of that post, and really for both parts, because the second part you'll be contrasting your impressions with what you came to understand about the poem after reading the Schmoop site, and then read the analysis on Shmoop. Those are the two kind of required resources, and I strongly recommend visiting the other ones as well. And of course, remember we do have that course content discussion forum if you've got questions about parts of the poem that you would like me to tackle or like to put out there for your fellow students as well. And of course, your discussion board post. I'll be looking at those and drawing threads out for everyone to consider as well. Okay, so it's a challenging poem, but enjoy it as much as you can. It's really powerful. It takes a while to really get to the heart of it, but don't panic. It's a difficult poem. It's difficult for everybody, so just dive in.